Bienvenidos a todos. This is Joshua Smyser-DeLeon for the Paseo podcast. We have Nina Vázquez joining us today. She's a historian, community activist, and educator. And to give you a quick high-level view of today's episode, I was on Twitter, as I feel the way I develop a lot of the topics for this show. But I was on Twitter and I saw Nina tweet this thread, and it was on something called the Black Code, specifically the Black Code in Puerto Rico. I thought, and let's have a conversation and take a deeper dive. So really happy to have you on the show, Nina. How are you doing this evening?
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited. I'm doing well.
I like to give our guests space to share a little bit about themselves with our listeners. So, Nina, what should our audience know about you?
I am originally from Puerto Rico. I am from the west side of the island, particularly Aguada, Puerto Rico. Moved stateside when I was 13 years old. I moved to Connecticut and then finished high school here and then went to college here. So I went to college at the University of Hartford, and I earned 2 bachelor's degrees, one in criminal justice and then the other in political science, both with a focus in racism and anti-Latino sentiment. And then I got into the University of Connecticut, which everybody knows is UConn. And I ended up studying at El Instituto, which is the Institute of Puerto Rican, Caribbean, Latino, and Latin American studies. What I ended up studying within that was history, particularly Puerto Rican history, 19th century Puerto Rican history. I absolutely loved it. At UConn, I ended up doing my master's thesis in the Black Code in Puerto Rico and what that looked like for Black folks living on the island.
Couple like questions in your intro, just genuinely interested. So in Connecticut, and I'd love like weird data like this, but like in Connecticut, we're talking about just under 300,000 Boricuas.
Yes.
So like a pretty substantial amount. That's more than we have here in Illinois. What is it like being a Boricua in Connecticut? Like, what's that experience like?
It's pretty cool. I think when I moved here from the island, I definitely noticed very quickly that everywhere I went, people were speaking Spanish, but also speaking Spanish that sounded like with my accent, right? So like I kind of felt in those little pockets, I felt like I was home. Then there's a very strong sense of, in Connecticut at least, but I'm pretty sure that like New York can be very similar, but a very strong sense of Puerto Rican independence and what Puerto Rican independence looks like and things like that. So I honestly, like, I can't even lie. I think I really started thinking about my identity a little bit more critically and just thinking about independence a little bit more critically because of Puerto Ricans in Connecticut. There's a lot of outside and inside influences in Puerto Rico when it comes to discussing the political status. Then being in the diaspora and looking at it from a different perspective, I guess honestly has fueled my activism, has fueled my passion, has fueled a lot of things for me.
You as la maestra, what is the Black Code?
Let's start off. I guess I want to start off like with simple, right? So I need to give some background in order to like really properly understand the Black Code. So prior to Puerto Rico being under U.S. rule, Puerto Rico was under Spanish rule, right? And we're talking about like for the Black Code, it takes place like in the 1800s and early 1800s. And then the 1800s, there's a lot happening, not in Puerto Rico, but just in the Caribbean in general, and honestly in Spanish America. So you have revolts in Cuba, revolts in Haiti, revolts in Dominican Republic. You have revolts happening in Jamaica. You have revolts happening in all these different islands across the Caribbean. You also have a very big revolt happening in Mexico. All these territories, all these places where Spain was in control of, right? So when all these places are revolting around the same time, Spain starts getting nervous. Because that means that clearly their grip is slipping. So they're like, okay, we need to do something. Something's wrong. We're losing our power. We need to gain our power back. So then you have this person, Juan Prim, right? And Juan Prim he was a soldier, right? He was like one of the highest ranks in the army for the Spanish army, but he was also very good friends with Queen Isabel from Spain. Very, very good friends with her. So essentially, what she did was she goes, listen, Juan Prim, I'm having these issues in the Caribbean, and I need you to go from Mexico to the Caribbean and settle in the Caribbean and then figure out what's happening there. And then honestly, just figure it out and get it back into place, right? So he's like, okay, cool, let's do it. So he goes from Mexico, and then he settles in Puerto Rico because he finds out that there's something happening in Puerto Rico that is making them nervous. So there's a whole bunch of revolts happening, not only with Black folks in Puerto Rico, but just people in general who are overworked and exploited in Puerto Rico under the Spanish regime. So he goes and he says, listen, I'm gonna basically be here and I'm gonna be like checking out all these towns and cities, see how everything's working. I need to see if like the people who we have enslaved are doing whatever they need to do, whatever. So what he ends up doing is he notices that, I guess what he describes is that the owners of the enslaved are not doing their job properly. So he feels the need to step in and write a code, which is the Black Code. And in this code was his way of honestly like putting everybody back in their place. So this Black Code, I ended up finding like one of the first drafts that he drafted, the one that like was pre drafted before it was published. So there was a lot of things that after the one that was published that it didn't like, there's just things that didn't make it to the last draft. But most of it did. So essentially in that Black Code, Juan Prim discusses how appalled he is with what he calls and what he describes as the Black race, the African race, more specifically. And this is one of the first codes we see in Puerto Rico where the Spanish are actually finally making a very loud written divide, where they're saying, you know what? Even if you're poor and white, you are still white. And that's one of the first written things we see in Puerto Rico where like now we're seeing that whiteness is stronger than your financial background, right? Unlike the United States, that has almost always been the case where like whiteness has always been held above, even with the financial background being different and diverse. But in Puerto Rico, it took a long time for that to happen. So Juan Prim makes it a really big deal and writes that down in the Black Code. So he says anybody from the white race who is threatened by somebody from the Black race has full autonomy to cut off their hands, to punish them how they see fit. So essentially, if you go from you could cut off their hand and punish them essentially how you see fit, that does leave room for even murder. The title of the Black Code at first was Desmanes Africanos, which means out of order Africans. Again, essentially hinting towards that there's something out of control happening in Puerto Rico, especially with Black folks. So he's making it very, very obvious that to him the problem is nothing else and nothing more but the Black people living in Puerto Rico. And he ends up passing this code, and then he asks for a stronger tracking system, which that is also a very important part for our history. So prior to this Black Code, Puerto Rico did have a tracking system when it came to enslaved people. So the tracking system was honestly all done on paper. And honestly, for us in our century, that wouldn't be effective, but for back then, and it was very effective. So essentially what they would do is it would be a piece of paper and it was a chart. And the chart was divided by like eye color, texture, skin color, name of owner. That's how it was breaking down. Then it would have another column all the way at the end, and it would say like additional notes, right? So like meaning like If you notice that the person had a birthmark in their face or something like that, like you would write that down on that column. So essentially, like these Spanish officers would go into the homes of like slave owners, and they would sit down and they would tell the owner, hey, bring me the people you have enslaved, right? So they would bring them, sit them down, and then the Spanish official would then look at them, sit in front of them, look at them, and then annotate all their physical characteristics and things like that. Then at the end, they would have the owner sign off the paper. So essentially, now they would take this paperwork, bring it to San Juan, and then have it looked over, archived, and then eventually sent back to Spain. Again, they had full record of who was where, when, how long, and how old, and what they looked like. So another important piece of this is that the Spanish were really honestly cataloging what and who was Black. What did Blackness look like to them? And what was Blackness to them? So honestly, it's very hard to say in our terms of what we think Blackness is, if it's the same or similar to what they thought back then. Because sometimes they would write on the paperwork, is a few shades darker than me, has a fine nose, but then in the race category, they would put Black. So there was room for a lot of error. There was a room for a lot of bias, room for a lot of racism and bigotry and all those things. So that existed. So then what Juan Prim does is he goes, okay, you know those that registry that we have? Well, I want that, but like times 10. So times 10 means now they're doing location, what town they're located in. Now they're asking them if they have kids, and if they had kids, are they under that same house, or were they gifted or purchased by another house? Now they're asking them how long have they been working in that house. They're asking them if they have ever escaped, and things like that. So now, with this Black code, another thing that Juan Prim was pushing for was, well, now if any of these people who are enslaved and they run away, we know exactly where to trace them and who they belong to. So we could go back and not only punish the slave, but the owner as well.
Looking at, if I understood you correctly, when you talked about the differences between the approach to race or status in society in Puerto Rico compared to the U.S., U.S. would be based more on race, whereas at the time, you're saying before the Black Code, your status in society would have been based solely on class, or mainly on class.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
And so we saw more of a leaning towards the U.S. outlook on your status in society. You also mentioned, Nina, that there was a first draft, and you had gotten your hands on that first draft. You said a majority of it was pretty much kept into the final version of that policy. I'm putting you on the spot here a bit, but do you recall what wasn't included from the original version?
One thing that wasn't included from the original version was, I guess they were supposed to be taxing the owners if they like had one of the people they had enslaved escape. So instead of being taxed, they would be punished or even thrown into jail. So again, I guess there was this thing where he was like, maybe this isn't me being harsh enough. Maybe I need to be harsher, right? Maybe I need to instill fear, not only in Black folks across Puerto Rico, but also the white folks who own them.
Let's talk about that a bit more. I mean, was it just taxes? Was it just taxing slave owners that was taken out?
Another one was, I guess he at the first draft, he had a list of things where like he thought that were like very, very disrespectful that Black folks would do towards white folks. So basically like raising your tone at white folks in Puerto Rico, or disagreeing with white folks in Puerto Rico, things like that. So he had a list, and honestly, that list never made it to the final draft. Instead, it was basically, if you're threatened or anything they do that is disrespectful towards you, you have the right to lash back.
Looking at reactions at the time to the Black Code, you talked about how slave owners would be punished if they did not adhere to this policy. were there any slave owners that were like, "F that, what I'm doing isn't right. I'm gonna challenge this policy"? Did that exist? I feel like it wouldn't. But
I
was
feel
that a
like
thing? I don't know.
I don't know. So I didn't get to that scope of my research, but what I was finding was that people like Ramon Betances, right? Um, what a lot of people don't know about Ramon Betances was that what he was doing was he was baptizing black children, because in Puerto Rico, if you were a black person and you were baptized, um, you had a very, very high price and people weren't able to afford you. So basically, your way out of slavery in Puerto Rico during that time was to be baptized. So I know there were cases like Ramon Betances across Puerto Rico where they were honestly like baptizing black children, so they wouldn't be sold into slavery. That's one thing that I did know for a fact.
What happens then, though? I mean, the parent if the are the like if the parents are slaves and the baby's baptized, like, can the parents get baptized and then that's the
So there were
loophole out, or?
cases, yeah, there were cases where adults were then baptized
Mm-hmm.
because in order to get out of slavery in Puerto Rico, but most cases it didn't work. It usually only worked if the child was baptized. So a lot of parents, what they would do was when they had a child, they would make sure it was baptized. So then the cycle would end with them.
Any other reactions to this policy? Do you know of any, like, government officials that weren't on board with this? Any, like, residents that may not have been slave owners that were against this?
Yeah, so there were a few people, definitely more in the academic sphere, that were completely against it. They're like, "Are you serious? This doesn't make sense. This is completely inhumane. What are we doing?" But honestly, there was a lot of huffing and puffing, but they also didn't want to lose their status, right, in
Yep.
society. So they didn't really want to like push back on it that much. However, you did have jibaros who, were white and poor, who were like, that's kind of like messed up, right? Like, and there were some type of like protests and just mobilizing and stuff against it, but it's nothing that really shook that system in place.
And then speaking of characters, who can you do you know anything more about this Juan Prim person? Like, you mentioned he was tight with Queen Isabella, but what else
Yes.
should we know about this guy?
He,
That
um, he
sounds
was
like an awful person, one of the most awful people in all of
yeah,
humanity's existence.
yes, he was he has a lot of bad fame. He was very, very racist, very overtly racist and proud to be racist. Um he shed a lot of blood in Mexico, especially when it came to indigenous folks. Mexico has a very, very sad and long, rough history with Juan Prim. Um, but interestingly, even Spain, right? So while he was Queen Isabella's, ride or die at one point,
Mhm.
he was the one who ended up turning against her for the Glorious Revolution. He was one of the biggest factors for her downfall. So he was upset because he was not going to be able to move up the ranks. I guess he was already at like the highest ranks, and she said that she couldn't move him up anymore, and he got really upset and he turned against her. And because of him and a few others, she had one of like she ended up having to leave the throne. Um, so it's really interesting to see his story and see his dynamic on how he was very trusted and powerful in Spain and in the Caribbean and just Spanish America in general. And then all of a sudden, that same person who had so much um, control and power is the same person who got Queen Isabella off the throne.
Wow. Stand up guy continues to to really show his character. My gosh. Quick sidebar though, Nina. You mentioned Glorious Revolution. Can you give us like a high level, like, Cliff
Yeah.
Notes version? What was the Glorious Revolution?
Yeah, so the Glorious Revolution is a really interesting time in Spain that I also wrote about when it comes to the Black Code, because I felt that whatever was happening in Spain was trickling down in Puerto Rico. So the Glorious Revolution is like they're really starting to move away from um, this idea of like blackness, whiteness, to then let's be colorblind. And all this is happening in the 1800s, which is really, really impressive that already in the 1800s in Spain and the Caribbean were thinking of race as colorblind, right? And I'm not saying that that's the better racism, absolutely not. But what I'm saying is it's very interesting that early on in the Caribbean, racism is already being thought of that way because of what's happening in Spain. So this glorious revolution has a little bit of everybody in the mix. So it has people who are poor, people who are of color, people who are at high ranks and stuff like that, people who just feel unheard in Spain, that are just angry at Queen Isabella. And then you have Juan Prim, who's orchestrating everything. He's like, you know what? We deserve better. We need more. We deserve respect. And, this is coming off from the man who helped her get where she is, and who was siding with her up until that moment. And all because he was upset because he wasn't going to get any higher than where he already was. And so this glorious revolution happens and she's dethroned, and it's all what people call it is like it was a liberal revolution. So like they're moving away from like this conservative view on society and politics, and they're moving towards more of like a liberal view of politics and power and things like that, which is why this idea of like colorblind racism comes into place.
So looking at those other parts of outside of Puerto Rico, was the Black Code an outlier in Puerto Rico, or were there other Spanish territories with similar policies at the time?
There were other Spanish territories with similar policies, especially Cuba and Dominican Republic. But one thing that I really, really want to make, I just want to say is that we got a Black Code because honestly, Spain was so afraid of what happened in Haiti. The Haitian Revolution scared Spain to the core, no matter how early on that was. Because as soon as they started seeing that other islands were revolting, they knew they had a problem. So one of the things that actually Juan Prim has written in his journals and stuff was, we need to stop Puerto Rico from becoming the next Haiti. So they did think that Puerto Rico did have potential of becoming the next Haiti. So that's something really important. Puerto Rico has always been very, very Black. Puerto Rico has always had a big population of African descendant people. And that has always been very, very mobile. So like, I think it's really important also to highlight that like Black folks in Puerto Rico were not just taking these hits and not doing anything about it. They were very, very, very much resistant towards it. They organized, they were always on the floor, always resisting. They were doing it all. But I think they get little to no credit, right? Whenever we think about slavery in Puerto Rico and history in Puerto Rico, we just never give credit where it's due. So again, for Juan Prim to sit in his journals and write, I'm afraid that Puerto Rico will become the next Haiti, shows that there was a lot of things happening there, which they were comparing to Haiti.
And yeah, I mean, that's a great point. And I don't know that enough people know when they look at Haiti today, just how much when there was that revolution against the French and Black people took Haiti for their own, just how globally the policies that were put in place to make sure that Haiti would not succeed, not just economically, socially, like just policy that would ultimately not set it up for success, as if Haiti didn't even exist. These policies were instituted at that time. So looking at Haiti today, it's really a result of, I think, and Nina, keep me honest here, really points back to that moment in time of revolution that really just explains completely how Haiti is in the status that it is in today. It's just a concentrated effort at a global scale. Remind me the date of the Black Code again.
From 1815 to 1845. It's around that range. It's no later than that, though.
So looking at the effects of it then, because you mentioned that there was Black people that did take action, that were not satisfied with this policy, didn't just take it. I'm hearing the date range in my head that you said, and I immediately think of El Grito de Lares, which is fascinating because you talked about this shift on how people's status in society was in Puerto Rico was shifting to more based on race than class. So looking at something like El Grito de Lares, that was something that was almost like the equivalent of the Poor People's Campaign, just unifying people across race. It was just based
Right.
off working class, working poor. Like you basically went across those different racial demographics to organize against the powers that be in society that were making reality a horrible mess for people at the time. And I always found that fascinating in Puerto Rico. And now that you say that there was this shift with the Black Code, that's making sense that something like that would even happen across racial boundaries.
Yes.
So would it be fair to say that something like El Grito was a result of the Black Code?
Yeah, that's actually what my whole thesis is about. I'm connecting the Black Code to El Grito de Lares. I'm basically saying that El Grito de Lares happened not just because people were just a random day they were tired and they just wanted to revolt. I'm telling you, there's years and evidence of this, and this is one of these pivotal moments, which is the Black Code, because even during their speeches they're saying, they're trying to turn us against each other, meaning by like saying you are white, I am Black, right? Again, a very colorblind approach. There's a whole bunch of things happening during this time that are triggering El Grito de Lares, because in El Grito de Lares, one thing that people don't know about El Grito de Lares is that it's not only Puerto Ricans that are in it. You have Chinese people, Chinese immigrants that are involved in it. You have Italian immigrants that are involved in it. There's a lot of immigrants from different parts of the world that are also involved in El Grito de Lares because they're all experiencing just the wrath of the Spanish regime and the racism and the stereotypes and things like that. So yes, El Grito de Lares is definitely correlated to the Black
Code. Last question I have for you on the Black Code really has to go with like sources. How can people learn more about this topic? But before I get into that, is there anything else on the Black Code that we didn't cover that you feel people should be aware of?
Yeah, I think the Black Code set the tone for a lot of racial relations on the island in general, even to what we're dealing with now in Puerto Rico and the racism now that's going on in Puerto Rico. A lot of it does stem back from the Black Code, violence done to Black women, violence done to Black men, Black children on the island, goes back to the Black Code. There's a lot. I think we need to stop viewing our history beginning with U.S. invasion. And we really need to start looking at, yes, U.S. invasion is a pivotal part of our history, but this goes way, way back. And we need to acknowledge that Spain does have a very big debt to pay us. I don't think we talk about that enough collectively.
How can we learn more about the Black Code?
Yeah, so there's very limited information with the Black Code. That's why it took me a long time to write that thesis.
Yeah. How long did it take you, by the way, before you went? Yeah.
It took me, oh my gosh, it took me like my master's program was 2 years, so it basically took me the 2 years. So yeah.
Wild. Okay, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, no worries. So definitely I would say you could search up, honestly, like a simple Google search like Juan Prim, Black Code Puerto Rico. It comes up. There's a few good public historians that have done the work on it. And they write good blogs on it that I also use as some of my secondary sources. And then, primary sources. Then I honestly, going into the Spanish digital archives, because that's where I found Juan Prim's first draft. Puerto Rico archives don't have it, but Spain does. So if people are interested, honestly, typing in digital archives of Madrid, and then going in there and in their search bar putting Juan Prim, it would come out as Desmanes Africanos. That would be the title of the Black Code. So that would definitely be one. Another book that I use that can be looked at basically it kind of like talks about the Black Code without saying it's the Black Code, is the Four-Storied Country. That's the title of the book. Oh my God, I'm blanking on the author's name. I want to say it's Josue. Let me check this. The Four-Storied Country. Yes, it's Puerto Rico, the Four-Storied Country by Jose Luis Gonzalez. That's definitely a really good source for people who are trying to understand slavery in Puerto Rico.
Hola, Joshua Smyser-DeLeon here, founder and host of the Paseo podcast. Thanks for listening to the show, where we highlight stories by, from, and about the Puerto Rican community, from La Isla to the diaspora. If you want to help us share the diverse and vibrant stories that make up the Puerto Rican communities here on Paseo Boricua in Chicago and around the world, subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you stream your podcasts. Subscribing helps more people find the show and will help you make sure you never miss an episode. Leaving a 5-star rating and showing some love in the comments helps too. You can also give a donation by looking up the Paseo podcast on savechicagomedia.org. Okay, that's enough from me. Enjoy the show. Couple of last questions, some bonus questions before we wrap up our time together. We've been asking all of our guests this question, and it really stems from this past Tokyo Olympics. Jasmine Camacho Quinn brought Puerto Rico our second ever gold medal. Amazing. After she won, there was all this chatter online. Is she Puerto Rican? Is she not? She wasn't born on the island. She doesn't speak Spanish. Why is she choosing to represent us now? She didn't have to represent Puerto Rico. She could have easily won a gold medal for the U.S., but she chose to run for Puerto Rico. She is Puerto Rican. I don't think we can ignore the racial undertones there as well, based off judging her if she quote unquote looks Puerto Rican based on her features. But with all that being said, I initially thought, well, we should be asking people that question. What does it mean to be Puerto Rican? So Nina, I'm going to put you in the hot seat. What does being Puerto Rican mean to you?
Yeah, that question always, it's just one of those questions that I always think about. And I'm like, why are we asking this, right? What about XY person is triggering this question? Because it doesn't fit your stereotype of Puerto Ricanness. It doesn't fit your idea of Puerto Ricanness. Or like, what is it? You know what I mean? So my main thing is like, when I think of like what makes me Puerto Rican or what makes somebody Puerto Rican is honestly like, that's the country that I rep, right? That's what brings me peace whenever I go there. It feels like home whenever I go there. I think you don't have to know Spanish to be Puerto Rican. I think we've proven that we're way over that right now. We're way over that right now. We have more Puerto Ricans living stateside than we have Puerto Ricans on the island. I think our culture makes us Puerto Rican. I think the similarities across our culture. So I think it's important to understand that diasporican culture is different from Puerto Rican island culture. But it's still Puerto Rican culture. That makes us Puerto Rican. Also, who are we asking who's Puerto Rican? Are we asking Black folks who are Puerto Rican? Why are we asking Black folks if they're Puerto Rican, if they're really Puerto Rican? And why are we asking them to prove their Puerto Ricanness to us? Because then that means we have to do some introspection and ask ourselves about bigotry and anti-Blackness within ourselves and in our culture and community. So again, I feel like I know this doesn't answer your question straightforward, but I really do think that like there's so many things that classify us as Puerto Rican. I wouldn't be able to pick just one. And I don't believe a box exists. I think that's very limiting.
We shouldn't be putting each other into a box. And that's kind of why I asked that question, and you're right, like we should not be having to ask each other this question. But yeah, there's just some like people out there that want to challenge people's Boricua cards. Yeah. I don't understand it. Like, what does this bring you?
Right, exactly.
Anyway, on a lighter note, advice through life. You got your master's degree. You're teaching at the Boys and Girls Club. Like you're dropping knowledge on us in this episode. But looking at moments and people that have influenced your life, what would you say has been one of the best pieces of advice you've ever been given?
Definitely has to be not to marry one thing. So I was told that when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, right? I've wanted to be so many things. I wanted to be an FBI agent. Thank God that never went through. Because now I know too much. No. I wanted to be a psychologist. I wanted to be all these things, and I wanted to be free, or I wanted to be, stagnant. I wanted so much in my life, professionally and personally, and even romantically. And one time I was told by somebody who's very near and dear to me, it was like, why do you have to marry one thing though? Like, why can't you? What if you want to be an educator? What if you want to be an activist? Like, why do you feel like you need to tie down to one thing? Like, why can't you do it all? And I know that sounds overwhelming, right? Like, oh wow, I'm gonna do it all, but it liberated me. I think we live in a society that makes us and forces us to choose one path, one thing, like one thing, want one thing. And I just think that it's okay to want many things, want to do many things, see many things, be many things. So my advice to anybody out there would be, don't marry one thing. You don't have to be tied down to that your whole life. And that's very, very big for me. Especially me being as a Puerto Rican woman living stateside. I struggled a lot with whenever I went back home to the island, people would be like, oh, now tú eres gringa. And then I come here and they're like, oh my God, you're too Puerto Rican for us. Like, get out of here. So like, I always struggled between those two. And then I spent a lot of my teenage life figuring out, like, where do I fit and what do I have to be? And then when that person told me you don't have to be either or, that was very liberating for me.
That's great advice. I mean, it's not that you need affirmation from me, but I think it's pretty cool that you're living that. I mean, community organizing, teaching, I mean, everything else you're doing. I mean, it's fun to see someone embrace the juggling act that so many people might shy away from. You don't have to marry one thing. I dig that. Okay, Nina, we're at the end. We're at the finish line here. For anybody that wants to keep this conversation going, wants to follow, keep up with you, follow you, what social media accounts should we know about? Do you have a website? What should we know?
I don't have a website. I need to get on that. But
yeah, hey, throw that thesis up there. I mean, come on.
But definitely follow me on Twitter. My Twitter is, I believe, Nina Vázquez 23, but it's Nina, my name, Nina Vázquez without any vowels. So it's Nina Nina VZQZ 23. So follow me on Twitter. I'm always tweeting. I love doing threads, and I love making history as accessible as possible. Because I know what it is to not have access to archives or just history in general. So I really do think that making information accessible is really big, and it's a big passion of mine. So feel free to follow me there.
Nina Vázquez, historian, community activist, and educator. Thank you so much for joining us on the Paseo podcast and educating us on the Black Code today.
Thank you for having me.